All right, so what I thought we'd do today is rather than go through the slides in the book for the user interface chapter, what I wanted to do instead was sort of give you guys a practical example and then make sure that we hit on some of the big topics in that particular chapter, but do it through the example. So definitely read the book. If you want, you can look at the slides, which are basically just the subtitles of the book. But that's how we're going to do basically the user interface chapter, which is chapter 8, and then as a little bit of foreshadowing, we're also going to do the database chapter the same way for chapter 9. And then what I'll do is I'll just go through. Is there anything I've missed? There may be a supplemental thing afterwards, but probably not. So especially for this chapter. So sitting here in the chapter 8 material, what we'll see down here, yep, there's chapter 8, and of course you would know it's chapter 8, but that's what it is. It's chapter 8, and then right there is our friends, the Dignity Center. Now, one of the reasons I like bringing up the Dignity Center is because it was a really dirty example, and it was a pretty easy one to understand. So I'll just remind you a little bit about the process here. Well, what happened is that, first of all, the Dignity Center itself is it's not a shelter or anything like that, but basically what it's meant to be is a place where people who are marginally challenged financially, I mean by that, financially, or they're just vulnerable. They're basically vulnerable. They can come here and they can get some assistance. If they don't have any housing, for example, the Dignity Center would basically try and point them in the direction of where there could be some housing, and they would just point them in the direction. They'd actually set up appointments and things like that. If it was food, they actually knew where some of the food shelters were, what were open. Even simple things like where can you take a shower, or do you need legal advice, or do you need medical care? These were the kind of things that the Dignity Center was. It was sort of like a hub, and then there was the sort of an insurance spoke and a legal spoke and all this kind of stuff. It was a community of people that basically got together to try and help people help themselves. That was the kind of goal. And so what would happen is that people would come in, and they were called clients. They were called clients, and then what would happen? They've gotten more advanced now, but what would happen is that somebody at the door would look over this form and basically fill it out with them during their first session, and then after that, any subsequent sessions, it would be them and their advocate. So a Dignity Center client would be assigned one advocate, and that one advocate would sit with them and figure out, okay, what are your immediate needs? Let's see how we can get those fixed, and then let's move on to greater and greater stability. It typically lasted a couple of years, by the way. A relationship, the successful ones would last a couple of years, and they certainly weren't linear. There was plenty of times it fell back. And then would move forward again. It was, in my mind, one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. That's why I like talking about them, and also why I like using this as an example. And one of the examples, or one of the things that happened to me with this, is that my wife was talking to the person in charge of Dignity Center, and the person basically said, boy, do we ever need a database? And my wife, of course, said, hey, my husband can do that for you. And so I ended up basically sitting down with the director and saying, well, what do you need? And I did my requirements gathering, as we saw a few chapters ago, properly. But now what it is I'm looking at this form, and I'm thinking, okay, in this form, how will I translate this form into a graphical user interface form? How would you do that? And spoiler alert, I actually did do that. And I'm going to show you what I did. I did it in a technology I wasn't super familiar with, because it was the only one I could really guarantee access to at the time. And I did it probably about maybe 10 years ago. So, no judgment, but basically I had to make some decisions, and it was the decisions that I want to talk about here with this. So we had already decided at this point in the process that we were going to use a cloud-based database to take care of the requirements. And what was going to happen is that someone was going to be able to, this form itself would be filled out, it would be sitting in somebody's inbox, like a literal inbox, and then a volunteer would come afterwards and fill in, take the form, plop it down, and fill fill in their stuff. That's kind of what was supposed to happen. So it was my task to try and figure out how can I take this form and translate it into something that the volunteers could basically type in. So a couple things here. You look, and we're just going to do this form. I did the entire thing, by the way. So if you look, all of this stuff, I actually implemented. But I just want to talk today about this first page. Okay, the first page. So there's lots of information here. You got basically the date that the person comes in, who's actually going to add, who's going to be their advocate, their name, their phone contact, address, city, state, and zip. Check one. And by the way, I didn't have any choice on this form. Let's be clear on that too. I didn't design this form, right? I designed the form that came afterwards. But this form itself was designed by committee. And there are definitely some questions I had about this form when I got it. But at the end of the day, this is what they told me to code around. So this is what I coded around. So I'm supposed to, apparently, we check one of these. Their date of birth, their gender. Of course, they're very binary here with that. The ethnicity. What are they? Do they have any children? And if the answer is yes, then we go ahead and fill out some stuff about their children. Are the children living with you? Have we verified that they are living with you? Are they veteran? Do they have any religious affiliation? How did you hear about the Dignity Center? And then there's a sort of sign for release. And then down here, there's some other information too, the actual date. I guess that this form was created. And then the record number, this is all internal stuff, who basically entered it and when they entered it. All right, so that's what the form basically is. So how would we, what are some of the concerns we have with this? First of all, just so you know, there are some ethics concerns, which, go back to what I said earlier about how little control we actually had over this. For example, asking any demographic information is challenging. Asking any religious affiliation information is challenging. But you got to wonder, well, what is the reason behind this? Because the reason was not whether the person would get the help or not. This was all demographic information that the upper management of the Dignity Center needed so that they could present their work to the people paying the bills. So that's kind of why that was there. All right, so let's have a look. So first question I would think to myself is what information do I absolutely need from this form? And one thing I would say for sure is that this stuff down here would get dropped off. We wouldn't need to have the record number, the initials, the date entered, because all that stuff. We might give some functionality in there to basically, store who the user was that was entering in the data, and just have this stuff programmatically created, right? So, or controlled at least. So the record number would probably be some kind of incremental number that gets slapped on it when the user finally hits enter. We'd know who it was if we had the proper control requirement in here, so we know that Grant Spencer was typing it in, and we'd certainly know when it was entered. So all this information here, we probably don't need. The release of information signature. This actually is going to stay on the paper. We don't need this in the system, right? You could argue that maybe there should be something in the system to say whether they actually signed it or not. But if we understood the process more, before we get this piece of paper to enter in, the client has already signed this. So we don't really need this piece of information. So we can really just focus on this area of the screen here. So one temptation a lot of people do when they're designing forms is they create everything as free text fields. That drives me crazy, just so you know. If I have basically a constant thing of free text fields, it drives me crazy. There are definitely some things that we can do. Like, for example, when we're looking at the intake advocate, one thing we could do with the intake advocate is have it so that instead of me typing in a name, maybe it already knows who the intakes are, and there could be a drop-down list of the names. That would be considered a control. All right, so a drop-down list would be a control. Other things here, all these checkboxes. Now, we know why they're doing checkboxes here, because this is a form and you go check, 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 right? But a checkbox kind of implies you could be living on the street and living with a relative and renting a house and renting an apartment. There's probably a better control for this that would accomplish most of what we need. And that control would probably be, in my opinion, again, a drop-down, drop-down list too. We could talk more about that in a minute, but either radio buttons or a drop-down list, because this is going to be an either-or. This is going to be an either-or. And in the case of gender, and what would be good is if there's maybe another button here as well, but this would also be kind of a radio button, because you can't be click male and female and whatever the third option could be, right? You basically, it would be, either or. So, and you'll see kind of how I dealt with that. So again, radio buttons would be another control, and drop-down lists would be a control. And the other thing I guess I'd want to say about this is when it comes to birth dates, or any dates for that matter. Thankfully, the form itself has some kind of hint here as to what the date format is, so we don't start basically getting the dates confused. But there's nothing to say I can't enter the date in however I feel like it, unless we have sort of a control on it. So let's see kind of what I did about this, and let's see what I can do to get this thing set up. Give me a second here. I'm going to set up the screen so it looks a little bit easier to compare the form and my solution. Okay, so what I did here is on the left-hand side, you'll see that's the form we're looking at. And on the right-hand side, this is sort of the application I built. And to be clear, this is not, my solution isn't necessarily right. I'm just using my solution from a long time ago as sort of a demonstration. I'm using a product called Apex, which is Application Express. It was an Oracle product at the time. It was basically a cloud, a browser-based database. Let me just move this thing out of the way. You can see it's a straight link. And I have come in here as sort of an administrator, and then this thing down here is what I get when I come in as the administrator. So if you did try to type this link on its own, you're certainly welcome to, but I'm just letting you know that you're not going to see the bottom screen. You'd be coming in as basically a user. And what I did do for this one is I shut down any kind of authentication. And so it's a free-for-all pretty well to come in here. Now, this was sort of the opening screen, and all the data has been purged from here, by the way. So we actually don't have any data in here. So what I want to do first of all is I'm going to create an advocate. So I'm going to create an advocate so we have something to select from here. So I'm going to go add an advocate and just give myself a name. By the way, notice how horribly this is already. I'm getting a little bit mad at it. I'm going to go Spencer Grant and don't care about any of the other things. I'm going to go add the advocate, and that did it. Then I'm going to go Kruger, Betty, and notice by the way some automatic fill there, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And then let's add Dupe, Steven. Okay, so there you go. So I added some advocates. Awesome. That's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about this form here. So let's go to client. Now time to add a client. Boom. So couple things to note. The form is slightly different, right? But still kind of the same. You'll notice that advocates on the left, the dates on the right. That was just a decision I made. I don't know if that's right. But notice what's key here is that I'm using a control to auto-populate. Now, you could argue, and it would be not a bad argument, that maybe a button here should be placed, which would be another control. A button there could be placed to add a new advocate. Like, so if they saw a new name on there, let's say they saw, I don't know, Jack Daniels, and they realized, geez, there's no Jack Daniels in this list, they're kind of stuck at this point. So you could argue that maybe what they could do is have a little button that when you click on it, it would go back to that previous form. that basically said to add an advocate. We could put at least a stub in there for Jack Daniels, and then maybe they could send an email to somebody basically saying, "Can you fill in the rest of the stuff for Jack?" Or there could be we haven't talked about these yet, but there could be a trigger or something like that on the table for advocates or something, some kind of internal process that would notice, hey, Jack Daniels says nothing, and would send an email to some administrator saying, please populate that. One thing you don't want your graphical user interface to do is to block somebody, and this would block somebody if there wasn't a Jack Daniels there. We chose the automatic fill for the date. We chose the automatic fill. Now, again, I was just trying to give them something to automatically fill the date. And by the way, that is not the correct date format that they obviously want. So it's something to think about there. But remember, I'm not as familiar with the technology at the time that I wrote this. I probably could have easily taken that date format and changed it to this. But what I'm trying to do is auto-populate what I can. So I auto-populated that because now the user would just basically be able to zoom straight to the first name. But notice I do have a control here. I have a pop-up calendar. So if that date wasn't good, I could click on this date and get a nice little calendar and then pick something. All right, so that's pretty cool. Instead of the client's name, I made the decision to break up the name. Break up the name. For date of birth, of course, I have no clue. Maybe, by the way, DOB is not an actual thing. It's an acronym, so having this all in uppercase would have been good. These are, of course, called labels, by the way, advocate, first name, labels. And you'll notice, or maybe you don't see it as easy. Let's move over here. You can see it here. See there's a little question mark where your mouse moves over top of that. If I click on that, in theory, I'm giving some ability for help there. Of course, I didn't for this one, but there you go. So we can put some names in here. So let's enter in somebody. Let's actually, speaking of Daniels, let's enter in Jack Daniels. So Daniels, we don't know what his middle name is, Jack. Notice the tab order is important. Honestly, you guys in your world aren't going to have to care about that, but back in my world,
I couldn't quite hear you.
And
could you please repeat what
crappy
you said?
interfaces, that was Siri. And interesting enough, when I just said that name, that didn't pop up, but now the thing, whatever. Anyway, so where was I talking about? I was talking about tab orders. So it used to be very important that you would set up the tab orders. Now with people using a mouse all the time, not as important. But for compliance with disabilities, the Disability Act, you do want to make sure that there are multiple ways to navigate through your form. You can't assume that everyone has a mouse. And I don't know if you've ever been in a scenario where all of a sudden your mouse isn't working or whatever. And so tab order is still kind of important. It's just not as important as it used to be in the mainframe era. All right. I was talking about labels, and I was talking about how that should be in uppercase. So here we'll give Jack Daniels a nice birthday of, and actually I'm just going to pick March 16th, but in this case I'm going to pick 18 years ago. So let's pick 08. Okay, so Jack is a 18-year-old person. Now, notice in this case, I did sadly go with a binary option, a cisgendered option, but I did actually allow the ability for the person to not disclose their gender. And one of the reasons I did that is because I was aware that whoever was coming in, sometimes the client wasn't necessarily as forthcoming on a lot of details. And so I was trying to make it so that this wouldn't block you. If you didn't know what the actual gender was, you could always choose undisclosed, and that was the default. Then we have a street address, which is not mandatory. Now here's a key too, which it'd be great if there's some kind of asterisk or some way to indicate what was a mandatory field in this. That's important. Right now, I'll tell you the only thing mandatory is Jack. Everything else is optional because I couldn't assume that any of this information would be available. And then what would happen in theory is that as this person kept going through the system, we'd get more and more information as we went. But we're going to just, Jack doesn't have a street address, so we're going to leave that. The city, rather than leaving it blank, I'm assuming because the Dignity Center is in the heart of Minneapolis and because the demographics of the clients are likely going to be in Minneapolis, downtown Minneapolis, I have made the assumption, I've auto-filled it to be Minneapolis. And of course, I've autofilled that to be the state. Now, I don't know if you want to go through this effort of programming it, but you could always have this thing. So if someone types St. Cloud, perhaps the state would be autofilled with Minneapolis, or Minnesota, I should say. If this thing was Milwaukee, for some reason, which again, I don't know why they would pick Milwaukee if they're using this digging center, but then this thing could auto-populate to Wisconsin. So anyway, things to think about there. You could have one field influence another field to make the data entry smoother and also make it more accurate, because there's nothing to stop me from doing this and saying that Minneapolis is in Wisconsin, right? So we're going to talk about validations at the end of this particular discussion, but if you got garbage coming into the system, it's going to be very difficult to get information out of the system. And so your form is kind of one of the guardians of the data. And so you want, at the very least, for some validation to occur, or maybe even to help the user along. All right. It'd be really cool, by the way, if you could just, and a lot of forms do this now, if you can just type in the zip code and have the zip code basically take that and infer at least the city and the state. One thing about the zip code too, if I could do my life over, is that I didn't specify what the format of the zip code should be. So that would have been good to basically specify, is this going to be a 5-number thing, or is it going to be 5-4, right? Now, you'll notice the rest of these are, the rest of these, living status, which was up here. Living status is all drop-down controls, all drop-down controls, all drop-down controls. So that's one thing I want you to notice right there, is that that most of this information is done as drop-down controls. Now, when you're finished, now you might be thinking, but Grant, we're definitely missing something. What are we missing? I haven't done anything with children. Where is the children? I'm resisting some jokes. So in this case, I made a decision which I was going to address with training. So for now, let's assume that Jack's got no child. And we're going to just create Jack and see what happens. So there is Jack. Now, a couple things to notice. Now when I go to that application, so I'm back to that application, the initial page, but now it's shifted a little bit now. It's no longer, it used to be basically empty with a create client. Now we got create client, and now we've got basically this as sort of the beginnings of a client report. There's Jack. If we want to re-enter, we can always click on the edit button and go back in. And now we got some choices. Instead of create client, we've got cancel, delete, and apply changes. But notice some of these other things, like I said, I had to set up for the other form. So there's initial interview. So now we could create initial interview. There are referrals. Now we can do referrals. There were experience, which I don't think is really this. Yeah, I think there was another form out there. It's been a while, but referrals was another form, and then visits and focus. Anyway, so none of that stuff you really need to know. This was a pretty complicated thing actually to be done for free. But what I want to point out is that the children thing in here was something I didn't like. I didn't like that being stuck in the client form. I wanted this to be all about Jack. And now if we have any children, what I can do is come in here and click on children, and I can give Jack a child. Notice, oh, that's interesting. You guys have probably caught this, but did I give Jack Daniels? Jack Daniels is really Daniels Jack. All right, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. You know what? Actually, no, it's not fine. I'm gonna go back and change this. It's gonna be Jack Daniels. All right, Daniels. All right, so Jack Daniels. We're going to apply the change. There he is. So now he's Daniels Jack. That makes sense. What I wanted you to see is that when I click on the child and I go create, it's assuming the last name of Daniels. All right. It's not assuming anything else. So this is Jerry. So he's got a little son, we'll say Jerry. Jerry was born, let's just say maybe a few years ago. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick this date. I'm going to pick this date. You didn't let me pick it. Pick this date. There it is. But let's just go back a few years to 17. And I don't know if he's living with, actually, Jack has told me that he's living with them, but I have no idea if it's true. So I go verify, I go create child. And now basically there's Jack Daniels going back, Jerry Daniels, sorry, going back to Jack Daniels. And so when I go back to Jack, I click on children, there's Jerry. I go back to Jack. I create another client really quickly. I'm going to create one here, which was just the last name of Marvel for now. Marvel. I'm going to go, here's Marvel. Don't know anything else about Marvel. I can create Marvel. There's Marvel. If we look at Marvel, Marvel's got no kids. If we look at Jack, Jack has still got Jerry. And one other thing I want to show you quickly is if I don't enter anything, it says last name can't be known. That's the only can't be known. By the way, horrible error message, right? It should have said last name should be populated or something like that. But that's the deal. You have to have at least a last name in here. I'm actually, in this case, letting Apex's default processing take care of that. All right. So that's at least some of what the book was talking about. If I go back in here and look at Jack again, we got some other controls. We got the pop-ups. We got radio buttons. We have drop-downs. And the argument here I'd make for ethnicity would be better as drop-downs because there's a lot of them there versus gender, which is radio buttons. Gender, there's a lot fewer. So I would make that argument that that would be a good use of a drop-down list versus a radio button. The idea of flow, this should flow naturally. It doesn't make sense, for example, like up here, I've got stuff about the client. That's all about the client, then about the client's address, and then the rest of the stuff is this information. I've tried to keep it very close to what this form flows, very close to this flow. All right, so because the person is going to be looking at the form while filling out this form. So that's why I was a little taken aback even now after years of not looking at it, that I put that in a different order. That was probably pretty bad. I should have had the date on this side and the advocate on this side to match with that form. Just because they had one straight flex field there, or not just text field there, doesn't mean that I couldn't basically say, hey, you know what, let's break this up. Because maybe I'm going to assume that some future developer might want to do queries on show me everybody whose last name was Daniels. And that would be tough to do if it was all shoved into one form there. I took the phone contact out and I pushed it after the address. That's me playing God a little bit on that. I mean, the form wanted it there. I probably should have put it up there, but I felt phone was more part of an address, so that's why I put it up there. Even the idea of just simply grouping related fields is a decision that you kind of make when you're trying to translate something like this into something like this. And then up here, we got these buttons. In the beginning, there was only one button, which I had was create client. Let's go back and see that guy for a second. So right there. So right there, we got create client. And I had that kind of in both at the very bottom, because by now the user will have gone click, 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 go, create client. Over here, I put it up here because people are used to seeing stuff at the top, cancel and create. I'm assuming by now that they're not going to cancel if they made it all the way down here. So that's what's going on there. Let's delete Marvel and see whether I actually was smart about this one. We're going to go delete. Ah, there we go. We got a nice little pop-up basically saying, are you sure? Now, in this case, I think I'm just taking the default processing of Apex, but that's a very important thing. Are you sure that you want to delete? And this is called modal, right? I mean, at this point, I can't do anything else with this form until I've basically answered that question. So I'm going to go cancel. So that's an important idea too. I'm always giving the user some way in and some way out. All right. One last thing, and then actually, one last thing just about this particular section here. The other thing I wanted to do is, at some point, there were going to be hundreds of people here, and I wanted to give the ability to search. I did actually have a last name search here. And so what I could do at this point is I could enter in Dan, for example, and hit, actually, let's enter in Mar instead. So I'm going to go Mar, I hit enter, and now I just get Marvel, right? And I think I made that case insensitive. Mar, lowercase. Yeah. So versus Dan, lowercase. So, and then what would have been good is maybe to have a clear button there, but if the users are smart enough, they'd also know if they just deleted everything, they'd get everybody back, right? Yes, there you go. And I've actually auto-populated that with all clients so that they can see. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about some validations, because this is super important to me. We're going to go back to Jack. And in this case, I don't need this anymore. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move my head out of the way. I'm going to expand, and we can just focus solely on this form. And let's actually go in a little bit and make it bigger. All right, so here we are looking at the form. So let's talk about validation. So as I said earlier, when I was talking about Minneapolis and Minnesota, what we want to do is we want to make sure that the data is as good as possible going in. All right, as good as possible going in. Because we're going to need, we're storing that data for a reason. So we want to basically validate this data as good as possible going in. So some basic validations are is this populated? So you'll notice that when I try to basically create a client with no information, we got a validation right there. It basically says, hey, you got to have a last name. And I think actually if I cleared out the last name, I think this guy would get mad. I guess clear out the last name and apply the changes. So one validation right there is this guy, is this field populated? Oops. Daniels. Okay. Now, other validations, see, that's a neat thing. I should have put in here a save button. Right now, apply changes, saves the record, and then goes back out. So I'm thinking maybe perhaps a save button would have been good so that it actually stayed there. But anyway, so the idea I want you to get at is that you can validate at the field level, the record level, and at the data set level. So field, record set, and then data set. So is this field populated? That would be field level. Is this a date? That would be a field level. If I type in Mary had a little lamb, and then basically try to apply that change, it's going to basically freak out. But it's going to freak out with a horrible freak out. It's a horrible error message. And are you going to let me go back and fix my error or not? Yeah, all right. So don't do that, basically. But, you know, a better error message would have been, that's not a date, right? So, you know, is it a date? Is it a number? Those are some basic field level validations. Now you can get a little bit better, like for example, the intake date. What's a piece of business logic for the intake date that you can build into this form? One is that the intake date can't be in the future, right? At least make them question that. So if the intake date is somehow in 2020 or 2020, we're in 2000, anyway, 2022, for example, you could at least have a pop-up saying, are you sure you want to put a date that's like 2 years in the future, and give them that chance? Or you can just block it right there and say, no, you can't have that date that's 2 years in the future. What else did I want to say about, see, a lot of this other stuff I've kind of locked in. I've sort of assumed, for example, if you don't know these, it's undisclosed. But that gets back to the, you know, is it populated kind of stuff. So anyway, you have some basic format validations at the field level, and then you can actually put some intelligence into the field level. Here's another piece of intelligence, by the way, for you. If I go cancel, and let's go look at the children again for Jack and give him another child. So the date of birth. If we have the argument that this should be a child, then the date of birth should be a date that is 18 years, well, no longer, let me try this again. The kid's got to be basically 18 or under, right? And so you basically reflect that in the date. You couldn't have a date here that goes back to 1967. Or maybe you can. That's a discussion that you have to have with the directors as to what qualifies as a child. right? So there's some intelligence there with that. Now that's basically a field level validation. When it comes to a record level validation, we want to make sure that everything in this record makes sense. And one of the easiest ones I just brought up is that Minneapolis is not in Wisconsin, right? There we have two fields. Together, they don't make sense. Wisconsin makes sense by itself. Minneapolis makes sense by itself, but Minneapolis cannot be in Wisconsin. Together, in that record, it does not make sense. Trying to think if there's anything else here that wouldn't necessarily make sense. I suppose the date of birth can't be after the intake date. I suppose that would be sort of another one that's a little ridiculous, but that would be sort of another one. Yeah, I mean, I'm having trouble thinking of more than this, but anyway, that's just something to think about. Basically, is there anything inside of this record that doesn't make sense? And then there's a data set. So let's do this for a second. I'm going to cancel this dude, and I'm going to create Jack Daniels. Now I'm pretty sure this is going to have no problem doing that. So now I got two Jack Daniels. So, and by the way, with a name like Jack Daniels, maybe there are a couple of them out there. But when it comes to looking at the data from a record set perspective, what we'll be looking at there is do we have two instances of the same person? Or do we have children out there, and this would be hard to find in this thing, but do we have children out there that are not connected to any parents, right? In that case, something inside of the entire data set doesn't work. Yeah, so let's get back to Jack again here. Or we're picking an advocate that doesn't exist. You know, those are the kind of things, like inside of the entire data set, what can we validate inside of the entire data set? So you're going to be asked to do something similar to this, which is why I bring it up. So what I'll be asking for are some field level validations of a form that you're going to enhance, a field level, record level, and data set level. Okay. I'm going to pause the video for a second because there is a little bit of reporting I want to talk about. So let me just pause and then we'll get back to that. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this recording right now, and then I'm going to have a separate one where I'm going to talk a little bit about reporting. So that's it for the user interface part. The reporting thing will be following in the next video.